We have very little information about the victims of this so-called massacre, but there is one person depicted in the engraving who has achieved a measure of fame: Crispus Attucks.
Crispus Attucks is probably the most well-remembered name from the Boston Massacre. He was popularly touted as the first Black American to die for the cause of freedom.
Attucks has gone down in history as the first victim to fall to the British guns, shot at point-blank range as he stood in front of the crowd. But is this what really happened? Even though he was immortalized as the most famous martyr of the Boston Massacre, we actually know very little about Crispus Attucks. Was he a hero or a propaganda invention? It is time for our investigation to begin. On the night of March 5th, 1770, British soldiers, under the command of Captain Thomas Preston, fired into a crowd of civilians in Boston, Massachusetts. 5 people were killed and another 6 were wounded. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre and incited the American Revolution. But was the Boston Massacre really a massacre? Or did the Redcoats fire in self-defense? Did Captain Preston order his men to shoot unarmed civilians? And was Crispus Attucks the first victim to fall? American history turned on the answer to these questions. Questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Until now. Appropriately enough, our investigation into the Boston Massacre begins here, on Boston Common. In order to separate truth from propaganda, we asked reenactors to reconstruct the events based on eyewitness statements.
We need this much space to make this line.
By reenacting what witnesses said happened, we can see whether it was physically possible for it to really have happened.
When you come in as a mob, you're going to actually be close.
Unsolved history can discover where multiple sets of testimony agree and where they diverge.
These bayonets are going to be down live steel. You cannot let your attention drift from the bayonets.
We can then focus our forensic team on the places where the witness statements differ.
Now bring him to the portrait.
The shooting involved 8 British enlisted men and 1 officer. Our reenactors portraying the soldiers have reproduced as accurately as possible the uniforms and weapons of the period, including this replica of the Brown Bess musket carried by British troops in 1770. As night falls, our reenactors gather in front of the old State House. Unsolved History has arranged to block off this busy city street so we can reconstruct the Boston Massacre at the location where it occurred over 200 years ago.
To the right about.
The weather on the night of our reenactment is moderate, but on March 5th, 1770, the temperature was unusually cold, well below freezing, and a blanket of icy snow covered the ground. That evening, a sentry, Private Hugh White, was guarding the customs house located here. Around 8 p.m., a young apprentice, Edward Garrick, began to taunt White. The taunting continued until White struck Garrick with the butt of his musket. Garrick fell to the ground. Word of the incident swept through the town. A swarm of angry citizens descended on the square. Many of them had been drinking in the local taverns. The angry crowd surrounded the sentry and threatened him with bodily harm.
Call out the main guard!
While the entire town appeared to be erupting, Captain Thomas Preston was in the main barracks, across the street from the old State House, close enough to hear Sentry White call for help.
Call out the main guard!
Captain Preston marched in with a small group of 6 privates and a corporal. The British rescue team reached White and attempted to escort him back to the barracks, but they were stopped by a mob of 200 to 300 angry citizens.
No! You'll not leave! No!
Hemmed in by the crowd, Preston ordered his troops into a semicircle formation and took a position in front of his men. Several people in the crowd dared the soldiers to shoot, yelling, "Fire!" over and over.
It made the British soldiers feel like they didn't have any courage. You know, they're wanting to fire, they're wanting to answer that call, but they can't. And the crowd knows they can't, so they're daring them.
The ugly demonstration turned lethal when Patriot Richard Palm struck one of the soldiers, Private Hugh Montgomery, with a stick. Montgomery fell to the ground, then rose up and fired. Moments later, the Boston Massacre began. The other soldiers let loose with a fusillade of musket fire. 11 of the colonials fell.
Once they had fired, the mob retreated. So the soldiers reloaded their weapons, and as the mob had come back in to retrieve their wounded, the soldiers thought that the mob was advancing on them to do them harm. They leveled their muskets at the crowd as if to fire again. When Preston saw this, he immediately knocked up their muzzles, yelling, "Don't fire, stop, don't fire." Preston ordered the men into a column of twos and then marched them back to the main guard.
Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and other Patriot leaders quickly turned the violent confrontation into a massacre, a symbol of British tyranny, and demanded justice. Captain Preston claimed that the shootings had been a tragic accident, but it was to no avail. On March 13th, Preston and 6 of the 8 enlisted men were indicted for murder. The lawyer who defended the British soldiers was John Adams, ironically, the same man who would become America's second president. The trial hinged on one essential question. Had the British soldiers acted in self-defense, or did they commit murder? Most of the eyewitnesses to the shootings agreed upon the events leading up to the moment when Richard Palm struck Private Montgomery and Montgomery fired his musket. At that point, however, the discrepancies begin.
When Montgomery goes down, there are other soldiers that are witnessing this also. They have to protect themselves, so what do? They fire back. They shoot into the crowd. Their intentions are to kill anybody. Their intentions are to get the crowd away from them.
After Private Montgomery fired, we know that some, but not all, of the remaining soldiers fired their muskets into the crowd. Some witnesses said that the time between the first shot and the barrage of gunfire was 15 seconds. Others said 2 minutes.
We don't know the interval between the shots. Some people said the guns went off all at once. Some people said they banged at intervals.
Clearly, eyewitness testimony is unreliable. How then can we determine what actually occurred that night? Much has changed in Boston since the massacre. But bullets are still bullets, and violent riots still happen. It is time to recreate the events of March 5th, 1770, in a laboratory.